this good day. I'm Ron Nutter. I'm a member of United Church of Gainesville, and I've had the extraordinary pleasure of getting together with these two scholars and scientists from the University of Florida, African American Studies, Dr. Stevenson, whom you met last month, Dr. Taylor, who you will meet today. And it's been my job to sort of introduce them and give you any other announcements that might be useful to you. Pardon me. I don't know Dr. Taylor. I know her by the reports, by the descriptors that are given on her webpage and by her department. And I read that. I said, her research. This is a woman. This is a person who looked at slavery and asked herself this question, as any good researcher would. What was it like for girls who are turning into women to be enslaved? What must that have been like? And you know, there was no shelf full of books that she could turn to investigate that, because no one has really written very much about it. Her work and her research, by answering that question, has given us all another aspect, a level of appreciation for how human beings respond when they must respond under conditions of no choice and little initiative, how they must become resourceful and strong to go on each day and make something out of nothing. And I am pleased and feel honored and privileged to have someone of Dr. Taylor's stature here to talk with us about that interesting era that built this structure and that made some of this ground that we're standing on profitable from their labor. Dr. Stevenson, as you know from last month, was with us. He needs to say a couple of words to you. Hold on just a minute, Rick. I'm an old man, and I'm forgetful sometimes. So forgive me. You should have gotten one of these forms out at the table. If you haven't, you might want to get one. We offered a bibliography to you, and I'm sure you already have it. But we're not conceited enough to believe that the bibliography that we offered you is the entire universe of everything that can be read. I mean, there's a chance that you might read something. You might have an antidote. You might have an insight that you would like to share. That's what this forum is for, to give you an opportunity to do that, and we will compile them, and then we'll be able to mail them out and share with all of us. I'll tell you why I like this idea, and I'll reveal my bias to you. I am hoping that out of this 4-month experience, there will come another community in Gainesville that within this group and others who come, you begin to find out that, gee, there are some things that are connected. I'd like to carry on some of this work. And here's one way that you can start to share those opinions. So please use this forum. Okay, Dr. Stevenson.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Listen, first of all, thank you all for coming. When we first started this, I had the pleasure of preaching at UCG a couple times and did a couple workshops for them. And we were talking about how do we educate our kids. And there's a book by Carter G. Woodson called Fugitive Pedagogy. And he talks about how teachers had the other book. There were books that they got from the public school system and then books that they used under the desk when the teachers went around. So that's how this whole thing, that's why it's called the other book. But the point is this, what I want to bring up now. Just yesterday, the Congress, members of Congress were locked out of the Department of Education. And part of Project 2025 is to demolish the Department of Education. We started the other book because we realized how undereducated we are. At the end of my session last month, someone asked me, how can we continue this process and what can we do next? And I argued that before there were schools in black communities, we had churches. We had fraternal organizations. We had secret organizations. And I dare say that we need to think about how to continue educating our young people if this school system gets scrapped. So this process is not just about these 4 sessions. I think that we are laying the foundation for how we're going to have to educate the next generation of people if the Department of Education gets demolished. So I want you to think about that. If you can pass it around, think about some different venues, contact Dr. Ron or myself or Jackie, and we'll see what we can do, because we've got to make sure that our young people continue to be educated and educated properly, okay? Thank you so much. Dr. Taylor.
Good morning. You all are a sight, a lovely sight to see on a foggy Saturday morning. You look energetic, eager, and ready to learn, and so I'm excited to be here today. Again, my name is Dr. Courtney Moore-Taylor. Just to give you a bit of information about myself, I am a lecturer at the University of Florida. I teach in the African American Studies program. I served on the committee for Sankofa Society, which is a student-led organization, and our mission is threefold. We are there to help engage students with professional development. We also want to assist the program, and then we also want our students to be engaged in the Gainesville community. And so I've had the pleasure of serving as faculty advisor for the past 4 years since I've been there. Prior to coming to UF, I served as an associate professor in the social sciences program at Santa Fe College. I taught U.S. history as well as African American history there. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk about a subject that I am extremely passionate about, and that is exploring antebellum slavery. And so the goal today is for this to be an interactive session. As Karen and I planned the session, it was reminiscent of our days when I worked at Santa Fe, because for years I would go to teach my class, have a lecture on the institution of slavery, and then I would create a field experience where I would bring my students out and Karen would lead a tour. It's a phenomenal tour that you'll take advantage of the second half of today's class session. So as we're moving through today's session, if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand. The goal is for us to engage 35, 40 minutes, and then there's a brief video that Karen wants to show that will kind of move us into looking more specifically at the institution of slavery. Now, as it relates to antebellum slavery, it's important to note that I'm discussing antebellum, which is that time period, 1800 to 1861. That's important because when you look at the institution of slavery prior to, it really was a system that was ebbing and flowing. It had to essentially be created in terms of everything from the laws that were implemented, in terms of slave codes, even down to legislation that regulated the reproductive capabilities of enslaved women. By the time we get to the 1800s, this is a system that is pretty much well in place. Laws have been codified throughout southern states. You also find that there are even plantation journals that assist masters and mistresses on the best ways for them to interact with their enslaved population. And so as we're going through today's lectures, we're going to kind of engage those aspects. And the main individuals that I really want to showcase are those enslaved men, women, children, teenagers, and elderly people. And we'll kind of get into more of that as we look at the enslaved population. Something's going on with my clicker. So, a few things that I want to kind of clarify, that when we talk about the enslaved experience, it does vary by region. So individuals who were enslaved in a place like North Carolina, there are going to be commonalities of experiences, but their work conditions as compared to someone who was on an enslaved plantation in Louisiana is certainly going to bring about some differences. And so we have to recognize regional differences. There some really good work that's being produced that reflects how the regional differences even impacted how enslaved youth experienced their childhood, answering questions as to whether they really did have a childhood or whether it was stolen just based on whether they were picking cotton versus indigo, things of that nature. Additionally, slave holding size is going to impact how an individual experienced slavery. Now, for those of you who've seen Gone with the Wind, and we know the impact that would have on pop culture, unfortunately, that shaped how most people view the institution of slavery. Many people believe that for enslaved individuals, they lived on very large plantations with hundreds of other slaves. That certainly was not the case. In fact, in Alachua County, the vast majority of enslaved people lived on slave holdings that had 10 or fewer enslaved people. Slaves were extremely expensive, and so unless you had the resources to purchase one or to mortgage one, you were more than likely either not going to have one or you'd have to use an additional mode of being able to acquire one, which is going to be through hire. We need to recognize that although there are differences, there are commonalities, and we're going to engage some of those. We need to dispel some myths. All slaves didn't live on plantations. You're going to see when you look at the homestead or the plantation home there that it was more the traditional home that most enslaved people would reside on. Slavery is an ever-changing, ever-evolving system, and I'll use the term chattel as one of the ways that we discuss enslaved people. Another aspect that I think is key is exploring the idea of gender and age issues within slavery. That's important because when you typically ask most of my college students, if you were to describe an enslaved person, what's that description like? And without fail, most of them begin by describing an African male, because typically people associate slavery with individuals who are men. And that is erroneous in that you would have countless enslaved women who would serve alongside men. And so one of the points that my research attempts to engage is coming from the work of Dr. Deborah Gray White, who she produced a work entitled Aren't I a Woman? That looks at the enslaved woman. And she essentially argued that slavery was different from men and women due to sexual exploitation. And that's a very interesting concept to engage, and one of the things that is important to note, because prior to that, many people would not even really consider those differences. And one of the reasons that White's work is so pivotal is because when it was produced in the mid-'80s, there had been countless books that had been produced about the historiography, but there had not been one work that clearly looked at how Black women were being impacted by slavery. And that was unsettling because had it not been for Black women and reproduction, it's not going to occur. And so when we look at Deborah Gray White's work, we find that her work indicates some of the reasons for the sexual exploitation that Black women experience, the ideas that have been around from the days of exploration that Black women were naturally promiscuous, the idea is that if you use black women as a means for sexual release, that it's going to reduce white prostitution, it promotes white sexual purity, all of those things white engages. And she essentially argues in her book that this is not the end all for this study, that I am simply producing the foundation, hopefully, that other individuals will build upon as it relates to black women. And so the area that my work kind of engages is looking at the role of black women, but using the model of age. And that is something that I feel is crucial, in that oftentimes people, if they even move into the realm of looking at adults, slaves as either men or women, how many people think about what that experience was like as a toddler, or as a child, or a teenager? And so as we move more into the discussion, I'll engage more of my work that looks at it from the standpoint of age. So a few other things in terms of just general overviews. Antebellum slavery and the Cotton Kingdom, we know the role that Eli Whitney's cotton gin would play in that whole process. The fact that with the expansion out west, slavery is certainly going to spread, and it's going to result in places like the state of Florida really gaining a boom in that particular area. Question, yes?
What's king cotton?
Say it one more time.
King cotton.
Oh, I'm sorry. So king cotton is essentially the crop that would really catapult the institution of slavery. And it was going to be used with the Industrial Revolution that is booming primarily in the European nations, but also in the Northeast as well. And so Southern communities are going to be the ones that will provide that particular crop. And at any point, if you have questions, please, please, please ask, because it'll help this be more interactive and engaging. Okay. Other questions, thoughts? All right. So you have king cotton, which is primarily the commodity that's going to bring about a great amount of wealth. Now, certain areas produce different crops, such as tobacco in North Carolina, rice in places like Charleston. Each area is known for various crops that can be easily produced. For Alachua County, one of the ways that the migration began here was due to the fact that the growing season was longer. And it was believed that cotton could be produced fairly well in this climate. And so what happens is individuals who live primarily in the Camden, South Carolina area are going to migrate here to Florida, primarily Alachua County, and they're going to begin the whole process of trying to create cotton here. Now, slavery as an institution was banned in, not slavery, but the slave trade, in 1808. The reason was during the Constitutional Convention, it was argued that you should no longer import Africans, and so with that, it was determined that you can no longer legally go to the West African coast and acquire enslaved individuals. Did that end the institution of slavery? No, it did not. Do you think it actually ended people from going to the West African coast? No, it did not. But on paper, it essentially made it illegal to do so. Because slavery is no longer going to be supplied by those who are in West African countries, it now becomes a domestic slave trade, also known as the Second Middle Passage, where individuals who are in northern states primarily are going to be sold to the Deep South. This is going to be significant in that there are those, even today within historical scholarship, when they're discussing this idea of slave breeding, there are those who have real issues and argue that slave breeding did not occur. But I just recently engaged a really fascinating book entitled Slave Breeding that counters that argument. And they basically argue that when you look at slave ledgers, even though you're not going to find individuals who speak specifically, in most cases, about breeding slaves, the whole institution of slavery was based upon the notion of having individuals breed with one another so that you could continue this reproduction. Now, if you notice on the slides, you see that most individuals are coming from the northeastern portion of the country, and they are moving down to the southeast. When we look at the state of Florida, you're going to see that most of the slave trade in terms of buying and selling slaves took place in Tallahassee. Those individuals who would be sold in Tallahassee would then be moved to counties such as Gaston, Jefferson, Alachua County. In terms of numbers, these are the numbers for the state of Florida. So we know that it was a territory in 1822. By 1845, it would become a state. And so individuals began to move into the area in 1830. So in 1830, you see that the enslaved population is a little over 7,500. Continues to grow. And so by the time we get to 1860, it's a population of over 61,000 individuals who are enslaved in the state of Florida.
What's the total population?
So by 1860, the total population is 140,000 residents, which is significant because when you look specifically at Alachua County, yeah. And so that's going to impact Reconstruction because many of these people don't leave after Reconstruction. Many enslaved people, as you're going to find, continue to remain here. And so there's going to be a strong Black presence that's able to now participate in things like voting, which is why you have Josiah T. Walls, who's able to serve as mayor of Gainesville and to go serve on the national level. So these numbers are quite significant because the individuals who are descendants of these individuals are still around, alive, well today, right here in our community. Okay. Yes.
So when they banned importing slaves from West Africa, then were they still able to bring slaves to like Hispaniola and to the islands and bring slaves from there, or was that cut off as well?
So those individuals that were still in Spanish slavery would still be able to acquire them. It would only apply to those territories that were under United States regulation. Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Yes.
So in the North, instead of freeing the enslaved people, they were sold to people in the South?
Yes, because it will become a very effective way to gain finances, because any extra slaves that you had that you didn't necessarily need to work your fields, you could then either hire them out to the state to do various forms of work, help build the infrastructure, or you could sell them to aid in the process of you being able to build your coffers. And keep in mind that for slave masters and mistresses, as with any parent, you want to be able to provide some type of legacy for your children. So it's helping in that regard as well.
No, but I'm talking about the time when it became illegal in the North to have slaves. Just at the, at the very short time in between when they had to free their slaves. Do they sell them instead of having them free?
So they did not have to free them until the 13th Amendment. So at this point, when I spoke of 1808, with them not being able to acquire them from West Africa. So they can still legally retain slaves. They just cannot go to use that particular area as their source. Okay. Other questions? I did have a couple points I wanted to make for this particular slide. When you are thinking about the domestic slave trade, recognize that it is a business. So you had companies such as the Dickinson Healing Company. You can actually access their records. You find that they put out various forms to give you an idea as to what the value of particular slaves were. So if you were in the market for a teenage slave between the ages of 10 to 14, they would indicate this is around the average price that you'll need to be prepared to pay for a boy versus a girl, those types of things. Also note that within this particular slave trade, it is going to primarily be teenagers to the young adult people, because you're using them for their labor as well as their reproductive capabilities. And so you want those who are going to be in a position to have babies and to work hard. And so the older you get, it's certainly going to eliminate your chances of being sold in the domestic slave trade. So an area that I want to engage are the life cycles. And if we all take time to think back to our lives, most of us can remember at least early elementary school. Like I have a few faint memories being around 5. We can recall our middle school days, high school, those types of things. And so just because these individuals were enslaved didn't divorce them from that piece of humanity. They were still babies who had parents who loved them. They were toddlers who had to learn how to walk. They were children who got in fights with their brothers and sisters. And so we want to look at what that aspect was like. So first area is slavery and childhood. This is the point where your chances of being sold is significantly low. Why do you think it would be so low? Can't work. Can't reproduce. You also are not in a position to take care of yourself, right? So you have to have parents who are going to assist you. And so for the most part, very rarely are you going to see a child sold alone. Now, typically, if you are going to be sold, you have to be sold with a parent for some of those reasons that we mentioned. Certain states, like in Louisiana, they would have a law that forbade any slave trader from bringing a child 10 years old or younger by themselves to that particular community, because they would not be responsible for reselling that child. That child had to be accompanied by a parent. Most slave children did not survive past 5 years of age. 50% of them passed away before they were 5. That's a huge number. And during instances where there were epidemics, so like in North Carolina, there was a cholera outbreak, it would wipe out several of the children at one particular plantation. Most of the children, their care depended upon the size of the slaveholding. And so if you recall, I said that most slaveholdings were smaller in size, so about 10. In those cases, those children are going to accompany their parents to the fields, or they'll hang around the house with the mistress. It's only on larger plantations where there were a couple of hundred. So like with Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, where he had a large estate, those children are going to be taken from their slave cabin and dropped off with either an elderly slave or with an older slave child. Almost comparable to like our daycare system today. In terms of work, the tasks that children were introduced to included fanning whites, carrying water, playing with white children. And like children today, they didn't see it as something burdensome. So I can recall when I had a little cousin, it was after a Thanksgiving dinner. She was like 4. And you know, Thanksgiving is dishes everywhere, and I was washing dishes. And she came to me and she said, "Can I help you wash dishes?" And I said, "Yeah." And then I thought, when you become 16, same thing with enslaved individuals. I don't know why, but human nature is such that we always want to do what big people do. And so these enslaved individuals were no different. And so they were excited to be able to go and give mama water in the field because they don't have a full understanding of what's forthcoming. Some of them were very well aware that their job was to play with white children, and that would be due to the fact that many of the white children would make it known to them. There's one WPA narrative that engages that, and the children are playing, and the little enslaved child says that they don't want to do something. No, I don't want to play that. And so the master, the young master says, yes, you are too. And he says, no, I'm not. Says, you are because my daddy paid $200 for you to play with me. And so those instances are beginning to shape enslaved youth's mindset that they are indeed pieces of property. There's a quote that I love that says that slaves weren't brought from Africa to America, but people were brought and turned into slaves. And so this whole process of that turning is what my work specifically looks at. Questions, thoughts? Yes?
Dr. Taylor, on that note, can you talk a little bit about the change in language? Right, I've heard you kind of go back and forth between they were slaves, they were enslaved, but I know there's been like a kind of a process of making sure that people understand that personhood by using enslaved people rather than slaves. Can you talk?
I certainly can. Thank you, Dr. Barnes. And so I'm dating myself with the use of that language because I attended my master's degree and all that stuff in the early 2000s. And then around the time that Deborah Ray White kind of sent her revised work, it was this argument that we need to begin to reconceptualize how we speak about enslaved people. And so you're right, I have used them interchangeably. The reason that we use the term enslaved is because it is a condition that was forced upon them. It does not mean that simply because their personhood was considered chattel in bondage, that they were ever mentally slaves. To be a slave is a condition that you pretty much accept, but to be enslaved is to have that condition forced upon you. One of the individuals that I study in my work, Elizabeth Keckley, she has a quote that says, I was born free in thought, but fettered in action. And what we find is that enslaved people constantly, in the process of resisting, showed that. They demonstrated their agency. If you've not read Frederick Douglass's narrative, I highly recommend it. It speaks to this whole notion of identity formation and age. And in it, he talks about how he's been sent to Mr. Covey's farm. Mr. Covey is a slave breaker. Their job is to break the spirits of enslaved individuals who are considered to be kind of too rambunctious. They don't listen. They're disobedient. And so as a teenage boy, Frederick Douglass was viewed as that type of individual. They sent him to Mr. Covey's farm. And so Mr. Covey, he said, beat him every single day for 6 months straight, almost unmercifully, for the least infraction. And one of the areas that he describes is how it just psychologically, his spirit was destroyed. And he said that one day, that little last ember that was in him, it awoken. And he said Mr. Covey went to beat him. And the statement that I love so much that he makes, he says, you have seen how a man was turned into a slave. Now you will see how a slave was turned into a man. And over the course of 2 hours, this teenage boy fought this man with everything he had because he was determined, you're not hitting me today. And he said that at the end, there was no clear victor, even though I disagree with Douglass in that the fact that he, as a teenage boy, was able to stop this man, I all day say he was the victor. He says that from that point on, Covey, for the remaining 6 months that he had on his period of hire, never touched him again. And he said at that point, even though he remained a slave physically for at least another 2 or 3 years, mentally he was free. And that would be the beginning of him preparing to escape and become one of the most profound activists, not only for slavery, but for women's rights that the United States and even the world has ever known. I thought I saw him.
Yes, you mentioned resistance. Could you talk a little bit about how this notion being sold down the river, the recalcitrant slaves from the north were sent down to Florida because it was probably one of the most vicious places for slavery?
Yes. So when we talk about the different forms of punishment that enslaved people had to endure for breaking some types of forms of, whatever the code may be on the plantation, the fear was that either having someone from your family sold away from you or being sold south would be two of like the most dire threats, because without fail, the work conditions are so much more intense, especially if you're producing, like if you're sent to Louisiana and you're having to produce sugarcane. That was an extremely difficult crop to harvest. It would require almost 18 hours a day of work in very extreme conditions. And so enslaved people knew that the further south you went, the more dangerous it was going to be, the more difficult your life, and in fact, your life expectancy was going to be shortened.
And great point, and just also to continue that geographically, the fear was if you acted up, even in the U.S. South, you'd be sent to the Caribbean, where it's worse. Wow. Allegedly.
Yeah. And so these individuals are living in these conditions. These children are living in these conditions. And although children are not as aware fully, because they have parents who are trying to protect and insulate them from the reality, but you have teenage girls. And if they're like my twin daughter, even though you're trying to do everything to keep them out of the conversation, they still gonna be able to figure out, well, what were you talking about? What is that about? Okay. So, anybody else have any questions about children? I will say, in terms of how they were sold, because prices, they tended to be lower in price. I have seen one bill of sale where there was an infant that was sold for $5. And I have not been able to put all the pieces together, but my position is that perhaps that child, because there's no record of the mother being sold, I'm thinking that that child was sold as a retaliation against one of the parents, because you typically wouldn't sell a child that young. Most children their price is going to be based on their weight. So they would weigh them and then determine how much they're going to be able to receive.
You don't think maybe the mama died in childbirth or something?
So if the mom had died, and that's a reality, but within the slave community, they had what was known as fictive kin. So we call them play cousins, play aunties. I tell my students, like, your mom as your auntie, that's your mom's friend, y'all ain't bit more kin. But that's your aunt, they're your cousins, and that individual who is the fictive kin would have assumed the responsibility. That is one of the things that African American families during that time period really were sensitive about. They knew that there was no guarantee that they would see their children grow to adulthood and to be able to take care of themselves. So they already had these plans in place that if you go to sleep at night and you wake up and mama's not here, that's your mama now. And that woman knew that this is going to be the child that I take under my wing, just as if the reverse happens to me. She's going to take my child under their wing. I thought I saw another.
I was just going to suggest also that it could have been the offspring of one of the slave owners.
That's also another good point. But in that regard, and that could have happened, especially if the mistress had a real problem.
Yeah, that's the point. Yeah.
Because for him, because you're able to.
That's right.
And that's one of the things I tell my classes. Let's be real when we look at this. That if I'm the mistress and the person that's now serving me looks just like my husband, we're gonna have a real problem. I can't say anything to him because white women were certainly not full citizens either. So who am I going to take this aggression out on? On that child who is powerless against whatever I want to do. Yes, ma'am.
And I've heard that the only thing that a white woman was allowed to own was a slave, so she could have been one herself.
So there is work that looks at enslaved women who were slave mistresses, who were slave owners. Certainly they were able to, and many of them would be able to acquire their enslaved property, especially if they were wealthy, from their parents. One WPA narrative that I studied, when they asked the former slave who she belonged to, she said, "I belong to Miss Sarah. I was her wedding gift." So those types of instances would certainly occur.
So what do you mean when you say WPA?
Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, so Works Progress Administration interviews. We are aware of the Great Depression and how there were federal initiatives to attempt to get people back to work. And so one of the things that they did would be to hire scholars who would go around and begin to collect the stories of formerly enslaved people. And they're really, really rich sources. It is. You can access them online at the Library of Congress. I also, like in my class, I teach a course on this, Slavery and Black Girlhood, and one of the assignments that students have to do is to glean through those really, really rich resources. But yeah, okay. Other questions or maybe terminology that I've used that you may not be familiar with? Okay. Mm-hmm.
You said that the mortality rate was 50%.
Yes.
I wondered how that compares to the white population.
So it was certainly not as high, but white children also during this particular time period had a fairly significant mortality rate as well, because we have to also recognize medical science was certainly nowhere close to where it is. In fact, one of the positives that will come out of the Civil War is advancements that will be made in medicine, but children of all races are going to be adversely impacted, but especially black children because of poor nutrition, things of that nature. Okay. So now, slavery and adolescence. This is significant to me because at the point where you look at the 1860 census, there were close to 4 million enslaved people in the United States. Now, I failed to mention, people erroneously think that the vast majority of individuals who were enslaved in the United States were imported. That is not the case. Only about 300,000 came to the United States of America. So think about 300,000, close to 4 million. That's occurring through reproduction. And so what happens is that when you look at this number, what was astonishing to me is that about 3 million of those are individuals who were 18 years of age and younger. And nobody has thought, well, what was life like for them? And so what my research has attempted to do is to ask the question of what it was like to go through puberty while being considered a piece of property. So think back to your teenage years. You want to make sure your hair in the right spot, you got your outfit together, what type of friends you're going to have, all of those things, the physical changes that's occurring, the fact that one day you won't be snuggled up to mommy and the next day you're so independent because you're grown and all of this stuff. Those are the same types of emotions that enslaved youth went through. And so in looking at plantation diaries, I've also explored pop culture, so looking at writings by like Mark Twain, WPA interviews, as well as looking at slave narratives by Harriet Jacobs, Elizabeth Keckley. I've come away with some commonalities that indicate that these enslaved youth were beginning to fully realize what the institution of slavery was about. And so the areas that I've identified include changes in their work. So as children, they did little work. Those things that they did do, they essentially thought was fun for them to do. But by the time they reached 10 to 12 years of age, that's when they typically began to start working from a formal sense. Now, both boys and girls traditionally started working in the slaveholding home. And so by starting to work in that slaveholding home, many of them are exposed to white society in a way that they had not previously been exposed to before. And for many of them, it's the first time that they receive any type of physical punishment from their master or mistress for mistakes that they made. They would use this process to kind of weed out who's going to be the better person to serve in a domestic capacity, and then those who weren't were going to be sent to the field. Field work is going to be difficult, but what historians are beginning to find out is that even though you worked out in the field, you had the privilege of being able to be in community with other enslaved people. When you were in the big house, you weren't given that privilege. And in most cases, you worked 24 hours a day. Elizabeth Keckley is a wonderful person to explore. If you're ever in North Carolina, I encourage you to go to the Burwell Historic Site where you get to see where she served. She talked about how she started actually working, caring for a child at 4 years of age. And she was so excited to be rocking the baby. And so she rocked the baby so vigorously that the baby fell out. And so she's afraid, like, the mistress is going to be really mad. But remember, she's only 4, so she's trying to figure out, what am I going to do with this baby? So she gets a shovel to start trying to pick the baby up. And right when she has the baby on the shovel, trying to get, the mistress comes in. And she says that is the first and the worst beating she'd ever experienced. So imagine being that young and that shaping your sense of who I am as an individual. Unfortunately for Keckley, that type of mistreatment would continue because once she moves from Virginia to North Carolina to the Burwell house, she said she did the work of 3 servants easily. And what's interesting is, having visited there last year and gone on the tour and having spoken with the different experts there, they talk about how the mistress, Mrs. Burwell, had a vendetta for some reason against her, and she would not only beat her, but also have other people in the community beat her as well for really no reason. And so she lived in these types of conditions, having to work at this school.
That's true. In that context, could you talk a little bit about the Casual Killing Act and how that came into existence in reference to how white women would beat their slaves?
Say it one more time.
The Casual Killing Act.
Okay. In terms of, if you'll expound upon that a little bit, just to kind of jog my
So the
memory.
Casual Killing Act was, if an enslaved person was beat to death by a master, etc., it was not considered a felony.
Oh, yeah.
And the act came into existence because, one of the reasons it came into existence, because so many white women were killing these enslaved girls or kids in the house. And so they created this system where if an enslaved child was killed by a mistress or a master, it wasn't a felony. It was called the Casual Killing Act.
And because it's their property, you have, slaves were not bound under the legal system of the United States of America. And so there's a whole different section, but you could do a course or even scholarship that looks at slaves and their interaction with the court system. There are accounts where you would find enslaved people who would receive like defense lawyers, but for the most part, any type of crimes committed against them is plantation justice typically. Okay. Really quick, because our time is running up. The 3 areas that I've identified is work, also changes in clothing. And so I'm really excited about this. In August of this year, in the Journal of Southern History, I have an article coming out that's entitled Badge of Slavery. And what it looks at is how changes in enslaved youth's attire was an indication to them that their life is trending in a different direction. And I say that it's trending in a different direction because as children, they either went naked or they wore what's known as a shirt, a slip, or a shift. And slave masters are not spending money to clothe them, because that's an expense that you do not want to incur. I've already stated that 50% pass away, right? So why are you going to, if you're looking at it solely from an economic standpoint, why are you going to use that for an expense? So typically what happened is they would wear what I call like an oversized t-shirt. So if you've ever stayed at grandma's house and you weren't planning to stay there and she just gave you a big shirt to wear, what they would do is take a feed sack, they would cut a hole out for the head, 2 for the arms, and that's it. Slave children typically went naked, primarily during the summertime when it was warmer. And one slave, Mattie Curtis from North Carolina, she says, I went as naked as your hand until I was 14 years of age when my nature came to me. And when her nature came to her, and we know she's referring to her menstrual cycle, she went and told her mom, and then her mom went and reported to the slave master, and then she received a dress. And so my argument is that without saying one word, they speak volumes to the enslaved plantation, right? Because you one day are running around in this little shift. They even would play games with it. The boys like to hear the shirt tails pop. And so they said if you would run really fast, the wind would get caught in there, and they would play games like that. And so as a girl, you go one day from having this shift on to the next morning when you step out of the cabin, you have this full-length dress on. It signals to the entire slave community that now I am capable of not only more labor, but also I can reproduce. It also makes you more readily available to be caught up within that domestic slave trade that I mentioned. Because now you are able, in a better position, to be able to take care of yourself. So not only is it changes in their work experiences, changes in their clothing, but they're also going to be introduced to sex, either voluntarily or involuntarily. Rape was a very real happening during this time period. It would not be uncommon, because remember, the goal for white women was sexual purity, but that's not the goal for white males. And so if they are being instructed that you don't have sex with white females, who are they going to be instructed to lose their virginity with? Black females, enslaved youth. And so masters would commonly engage in sexual relations, raping black women. But one of the things that I also like to emphasize is that these were still human beings. They still had emotions that human beings have today. And so they would engage in courting, as they called it. They would play various games, kissing games. One was called In the Well. And so the boy would say he had fallen so many feet in the well, and it would take this many kisses to get him out. They would find ways at corn shucking parties. The girls would have their 2 dresses. One would be for formal events like church, going to parties. They would make sure that they could dye their dresses certain colors using bark from trees, various berries. They would dress up, comb their hair, put a bow in their hair, because they wanted to look really, really nice for the boys. These are the types of things that they engaged in as it relates to having an understanding of sex. And then you had your adult slaves. They're going to be the individuals that are most valuable. Elderly slaves, they're relegated to caring for others. They are also, in some cases, going to be displaced. Frederick Douglass talks about how his grandmother, after she had been utilized and her work ethic no longer useful, then she was turned out and having to fend for herself.
Turned out, you mean on her own? Totally.
Yes, and having to provide her own clothing, her own food, shelter, that type of thing. Yes?
Is there any documentation of gay enslaved women, girls, women, men?
So I have not encountered any of that. I have some of my colleagues here from UF. If any of you have, because it was going to be a very taboo topic. You have something, Marisha?
New research on, there's been new research on what we would now call gay relationships, homosexual relationships, but they wouldn't have been understood in that context at that time, for the most part. I think another thing that there's new research on is that this counter idea between white women's purity and black women's promiscuity, is that research has also been being explored, understanding that white mistresses and also white teens were also having relationships, and that was girls and boys, right? So white girls were often also in relationships with the boys and girls that that were enslaved on their property, right? So we also have to remember that sexuality was operating in its fullness, right, in plantation society. So some researchers are starting to explore all of those things. Like, there's been a lot more research about the range of experience during slavery, but I can't call on a scholar at the moment.
Okay.
It has been. If you're interested in exploring that, you can Google. It's your friend. Yes.
And I will say there is a project at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro I worked on as a grad student. It's called the Race and Slavery Petitions Project. And what it does is it looks at various petitions, like divorce petitions, and some of them comment on, when you're talking about like women and their sexuality, there are several that look at how slave masters were divorcing their wives, and they put in the petition because a few of them had abandoned them and taken up with some enslaved men in the quarters. Now, that is not going to be common, but that would occur. And they very well may have, in the years since I've been gone, found some that link to being gay and things of that nature, because it is, it's really, the index is really, really great. So I recommend looking at that too.
And also, while not exactly speaking to the question you're curious about, there's a scholar named Riley P. Snorton who has a text called Black on Both Sides, Trans Identity, and
Thank you. Yes.
And there's a novel called The Prophets that addresses slavery and homosexuality.
Okay.
In enslaved setting. The Prophets by Jones.
Okay. The Prophets. Yes.
When you're talking about elderly in the enslaved population, what age are we talking about?
So I'm speaking of 60s upwards, and really mid-50s, because as they are getting older, they're in a they're less capable. As we know, the older you get, your stamina just isn't what it used to be. So generally around that age. So our time is like up, and I had so much more to say. Does anybody have any questions or things they may want to ask that maybe I didn't get to touch on with the slide? Yes.
One thing that kind of comes to mind is the medical care that was provided for the slave, or lack of medical care, and how the slaves took care of each other, you know, and during those times, I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, so really great work. Some older, like Todd Savitt has done really good work. It's called Slavery and Medicine. There's a good book by Marie Swartz that looks at birthing a slave, but things within the Black community in terms of like herbs and things of that nature that would be utilized. Enslaved people, if they became ill, their master, if they were wealthy enough, could call for a physician to come and to provide some type of physical exam. Keep in mind that enslaved people did not have agency over their bodies. So when you're engaging in like the work with Schwartz's work, Birthing a Slave, there was an enslaved woman who had an issue of blood that she just couldn't be cured. And so there was a wound on her leg that the doctor believed was creating the problem, and they amputated this woman's leg without her permission.
Could you also talk about J. Marion Sims?
Oh, the gynecologist and the father of gynecology. He is responsible for a lot of the medical practices that are involved in women's reproductive care today. Those various procedures were actually started on black women with no anesthesia. It was.
Quite late in time.
Say it one more time.
Quite late, after slavery.
No, this was during slavery.
This was during
Yes, so he actually engaged in those practices during the mid-1800s. And so he would utilize the black women for those purposes. And he wasn't the only one. There would be medical doctors who would purchase enslaved people for the purpose of using them as medical subjects. And so, as you can see, there are so many aspects of this institution that you can engage. As I mentioned, I have some of my colleagues here today who would be great to chit-chat with. I just wanted to make a couple points about who we are as the African American Studies program. We are at the University of Florida, and we encourage you all to support the work. If you've liked what you've heard the past session or today, please by all means consider partnering with us. We do have some upcoming events. So on February the 18th at the Cave Museum, we will be co-sponsoring a talk with Jesse Hurd. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Coach Hurd, but he was one of the coaches who would integrate Buchholz High School. So if you've ever seen, what's the movie with Denzel Washington? Remember the Titans, yes. So if you've seen Remember the Titans, he is our local Coach Boone. So that's the 18th, starts at 5 p.m. And if I'm not mistaken, if you register, first 100 people get a free book that looks at black communities in football. We also have Dr. Deidre Cooper Owens on March the 4th, who's going to implement our discussion on women's history. And then we have an end-of-year celebration for our students. I have a bunch of stuff going out, like in class, so I can get y'all out to your next class, right? And then on the 26th at 7 p.m., we're going to have a fireside chat with Mr. Jones. So anybody who's interested, feel free to take a QR code. I also have some brochures from the program, my card, some pens. Feel free to get one of those. If you like the slides, just drop me an email, and I'm more than happy to send that information to you. And then I did have just a few references or additional sources for things that if you're interested. Unchained Memories is a documentary. You can just pull that up on YouTube. It's really, really great because you get to actually hear the readings from the WPA narratives. It's really entertaining. I recommend that.
Which one is that?
It's called Unchained Memories. Mm-hmm. And then Slavery in Florida by Dr. Larry Rivers, who will also be on campus recently. And for those of you who have grandchildren, I would recommend that American Girl Addie series. It's really, really great. Historical fiction that's quite accurate that will help younger students have a better understanding of the institution. And then lastly, if you have enjoyed taking this class, I don't know if many of you are familiar with the fact that the state of Florida allows seniors who are 62 and older to audit classes. Yes. And so if you would like to audit one of African American Studies classes, I strongly recommend that you do so. We'd love to have you in our classes. When I was at the University of North Florida, I taught a couple courses, and I had seniors in those classes, and it has been one of the richest experiences because not only were the students able to interact with someone who had lived some of the experience, not that we have lived during this time, but in a different class, who could share their lived experience. And so if you feel like that's something you're interested in, go to UF's registrar page. They'll give you the information, and then contact our chair or our assistant director, and we can see about making that happen in the fall. All right, thank you all so much.